Okay, let's start. So, hello everybody. Today I have the pleasure to discuss with David Swanson. David is the director of the organization called World Without War. He's also the host of Talk World Radio, and he's the author of many books, including uh, this one that I read, which is Leaving World War II Behind, and also another book that I have from him that I bought, but I haven't read yet, which is War is a Lie. I think you also wrote many other books, but I don't have them. David, you have a master degree in philosophy, right?
I do, yes.
Yeah. So David, thank you very much for talking with me today.
It's wonderful to be here. Just a very, very small point. The organization is called World Beyond War.
Or,
Everybody calls it World Without War. So you're just joining everybody else to call it
oh,
World
sorry,
Without War.
sorry.
Only problem is that you won't find a website. You won't find anything you
Uh,
search for if you search for World Without War. So it's World Beyond War.
okay. Uh, I want for the people that are already listening to me for those interviews, they know that I try to interview many people from different perspective about World War II revisionism. I interviewed some libertarian. I interviewed one Marxist historian that I think you know. This is the French version, but I think you read the English version of Jacques Powell's book,
Right,
The Myth of the Good War.
right.
And I also interviewed people that unfortunately are Nazi sympathizer. It's clear that I don't agree with that. I'm sure you don't agree with that, but I believe that those people have the right to express themselves. And my goal with those interviews is that I think that World War II need to be debunked as the myth of being a good war. I think that this myth is used since 1945 to justify and sell us many unjustified war, which are always imperialism. It also justified the growth of the state in so many aspects. I even think that the divisive identity politics come from the idea that the Nazi were evil because they were racist, which racism is wrong, is bad, don't get me wrong, but fundamentally the Nazi were evil because they were imperialistic, not just for their I think racism is bad, but imperialism is probably a lot worse because you can be racist and just say, hey, look, I don't want to associate myself with people of a certain race, which is not my case. But the fundamental evil of the Nazi were that they were imperialistic, like the British Empire, like most government of the time. But I think it's important that that myth be debunked. So, uh, the main question I ask to all the people I have this conversation with is for you, David, if you could, let's say in 20 or 30 minutes, explain why World War II was not a good war, like we are told by court historians, government schools, and Hollywood movies. So go ahead, David.
Oh, I will try my best. 20 or 30 minutes. Okay. It's a very, very important problem, as you say, not because I have an interest in history, not because I care what people think of something 75 years ago, but because every single time I speak to a Western audience about reducing military spending, closing military bases, moving money into human needs or retirement or education or protecting the earth in effective and useful ways. Uh, I'm told, what about World War II? What about Hitler? What about
Yeah,
the Nazis?
always.
Every single goddamn time. And so it's not me bringing it up because I've written a book in response to this endless chorus, but I'm not bringing it up by choice. I don't have any fascination with the stupid World War II looking tanks that Donald Trump just drove down the street in Washington, D.C. I don't have any, obsession with methods of mass murder. I simply want to be able to talk in rational terms with people today about ending wars, about ending militarism, about ending military spending and putting weapons in space. And the single biggest hurdle is lies about World War II. And some of the lies are, absurd and childish and not really taken seriously by any historians of any stripe, but are extremely popular and extremely well believed. And so if you try to debunk with professional historians the notion that World War II was fought to save the Jews from the concentration camps, they'll agree with you immediately. They don't take that seriously for a second. But my next door neighbors and people down the street and people across this country and your country and many other countries, they all believe that World War II was fought to save Jews from concentration camps. And so you have to start with some of these myths that beautify World War II, and then get to the more serious ones and debunk those as well. And so it's important for people to understand that Western governments and Western societies were extremely anti-Semitic. They weren't putting people into rooms and gassing them to death. Parallel the distinction you were making a minute ago between hating people and killing them.
Yeah,
Is a
exactly.
big distinction, right? But they were extremely anti-Semitic and extremely cynical and malevolent, and didn't want to make any effort to save anyone. And so there were big public meetings, the biggest, most famous one at Evian in France, that where the governments of the world got together and said, who will take the Jews? The Nazis are going to kill them if we don't take them. They want to expel them. They don't want to kill them. They want to give them to us. Who will take them? Not I, not I. We don't want them. We'll have none of them. Australia has no racism problem. Why would we import one? These meetings were led by the United States. Every media outlet in the world was there. They were the top story in the news for a day or a week. There was nothing secret about it. You had New York Times columnists saying, if we fail on this, they're going to kill them all and we won't be able to live with it. Our society won't be able to live with it. So the notion that people didn't know is nonsense. And the notion that people cared and tried to do something about it is also nonsense. Not a single diplomatic or military step was ever taken. Advocates for saving these people went to the British government, went to the US government, were told it's impossible, it's logistically too difficult, we don't have enough ships, etc. But behind doors, the discussion was it's too inconvenient. It would be inconsiderate to impose on any of our allied countries who don't want these people. We don't want to bother with it. It's not our problem. Let them die. And so there were people in these camps praying to be bombed as the bombers went over, but they never were. The bombers had other targets in mind. Nothing was ever done. And of course, publicly, the British had a written policy, never mention Jews. The U.S. State Department and military were very similar. Have a war, send your sons and daughters to die for Jews was not a popular slogan, and in fact was never used. There's not a single poster on any wall from World War II saying Uncle Sam wants you to save the Jews. As you might imagine, if you heard how people talk about World War II today.
Yeah.
And so you have to take some of those myths, the myth that the United States was attacked out of the blue, innocently minding its own business by the evil conspiratorial Japanese who secretly planned to drag the U.S. into a war it didn't want. You have to go after some of these, or the nuclear bombs were justified because they ended the war and saved vastly more lives than they cost, and so forth. You have to go after some of these core myths that aren't really central, that aren't believed by any historians, but that are fundamental to the mythology.
Yeah.
then you can go after the more serious matter of well, what about informed, intelligent people who believe that the worst thing humanity has ever done to itself in any short period of time was justified because it was the only way to stop the Nazis or the Japanese from doing something even worse, uh, or there was simply no alternative. What do you expect people to do? Clasp their hands in prayer and protest and kneel down and beg for mercy? Similar to this notion that you must either resist with war or do nothing and lie back and take it. And so it's important to address the grander time span, but also the immediate crisis that people love to dial the time machine back to. So, you know, the decisions made in how World War I was ended, the viciousness of the Treaty of Versailles, the stupidity of the half-hearted attempt at a League of Nations that failed in large part because of the United States, the arms race without end rather than learning the lesson and demilitarizing, the U.S. corporate and Western corporate support for the Nazis, governmental support for the fascists and the Nazis, the development of so much of the Nazi program that the Nazis learned from in the United States, the program of segregation, of concentration, of eugenics, of racism, learned, U.S. academics proudly proclaiming their success in teaching this stuff to the Nazis. Like none of those steps were needed. And you could take away one or two of those steps and not have World War II. Exactly. But nobody wants to ask that question. Like if you're going to dial the time machine back 75 years, you must not dial it back 76 years. You must go to the moment when the Germans are starting the war. Now, what do you do? So you have to answer even that, which is also answerable, though it takes more time than we will have in this interview, to educate people about what unarmed civilian resistance is, about what alternatives to military resistance can do, about the incredible success that various countries had in nonviolent resistance and sabotage and non-cooperation with the Nazis, with zero training or understanding of what they were doing. What even groups of women had success with in the heart of Berlin, but also the incredible growth in knowledge and success and strategy of nonviolent activism since World War II, since it became something to study and strategize and learn from and utilize to the utmost with preparation, and the incredible untapped potential of what training populations in unarmed civilian resistance could be were governments not afraid of their own people and willing to train their own people to resist other governments, even though it also trains them to resist domestic abuses by their own government. And so, there are a million ways to go at this. And I think starting with the most popular myths and getting down to the more serious details is usually the way to do it. And so the book I wrote, I'm just looking at my table of contents because I wrote this years ago. But, very smart people predicted World War II almost down to the day.
Yes.
Upon the conclusion of World War I, right? This was perfectly knowable. Everybody from, leftists to Winston Churchill, predict this thing and say it's not necessary. We don't have to drive toward it, but that's what was done. So it didn't have to happen at all. And anything that didn't have to happen, that kills millions of people, destroys cities, destroys the world, destroys the rule of law, creates incredible environmental destruction and financial cost, and fuels bigotry and racism around the world. Like, that can't be glorious. That can't be defensible when it didn't have to happen. And the United States didn't have to develop the bunk science of eugenics. the practices of racist segregation that Nazi lawyers came over to New York to study, didn't have to develop genocide and ethnic cleansing and concentration of people on reservations. With, people in the US don't know that Hitler saw the East as the West. Go East, young man. Go be a cowboy taking over the East of Europe from the indigenous non-humans, the way that United States did with the indigenous people of the Western United States. Didn't have to fund and arm the Nazis, in some cases right through the war. Didn't have to prioritize opposing the Soviet Union and therefore justify supporting the Nazis until it was too late. Didn't have to, develop its own fascistic rituals that are still with us. The salute was this and was this instead of this, but it's a very slight difference. Now it's this, but it's the recitation of the Pledge of Obedience to a colored piece of cloth that
Oh yeah, I love that.
people
I love
marvel
your
at.
expression.
When people visit the United States, they gawk at this fascistic ritual, and the United States is oblivious to even having it. The other strange thing that makes people at least willing to stop and think is that if the Nazis were the root of all evil, this satanic force of horror, and the United States was leading the cause of democracy and goodness, why were so many Nazis immediately hired into the US military after the war? Why did they build camps for Nazi scientists? Why did they have Nazi rocket scientists in Alabama developing the missiles that would destroy Vietnam? Why did they have Nazi scientists on Plum Island off the tip of Long Island in New York developing biological weapons that it would fail to kill very many people when tried in places like Korea, would do some damage in Cuba, but would also apparently give us, wonderful things like Lyme disease, that we're taught to not know where it came from. Why, I focus on Europe because it's what people love to focus on,
Yes.
just like they focus on Hiroshima and never mention Nagasaki. But there was an open public arms race between the United States and Japan growing for decades. There were marches in the streets of the United States. Stop the arms race with Japan. You're going to have a war, for years leading up to World War II. There were announcements in US newspapers of the start of the war with Japan prior to the attacks on the day that we now call Pearl Harbor, but there was attacks on Pearl Harbor and Alaska and the Philippines and islands across the Pacific. So this was a choice of the US and Japan mutually. It takes two to tango. It wasn't just Japanese attacking the innocent Americans, nor were the Germans attacking innocent US ships. FDR's lies were very almost identical to Woodrow Wilson's lies about ships like the Lusitania. So I think another thing that helps people in the United States at least be willing to stop and wonder is the fact that there was a lot of resistance. You would imagine nobody who got the chance to live in this glorious epic of World War II, the subject of more Hollywood movies than any other, would have said no, would have resisted, would have refused to participate in such a glorious, wondrous escapade. And yet they did. And hundreds and thousands of people resisted and fled and went to prison and were tortured and refused. And some of those people in prison refused to tolerate the racial segregation in the US prisons and created the civil rights movement coming out of civil rights actions in prisons by resistors to World War II. And so with racism being, the most popular evil and being legitimately actually pretty damn evil in US culture today, it gives people pause when their brains have to handle the fact that the people who began the most effective movement to scale back racism in the United States were the very same people who resisted the most glorious, wondrous war in US history that's used to justify dozens of wars that people themselves think were evil. So, um, one other thing that helps, I think, is that in the United States, people, including libertarians like yourself, hate taxes. They hate taxes more than they hate Nazis. They hate taxes more than they hate Palestinians or Russians. They despise taxes. But up until World War II, ordinary people were barely ever taxed anything. Taxes were created for wars and scaled back at least most of the way to where they'd been after the wars. And they were created for rich people. World War II, you got taxes on ordinary people. You got Walt Disney cartoon videos glorifying taxes on ordinary people. And, and Irving Berlin songs and propaganda celebrating, I get to pay taxes to help kill the Nazis. And then they didn't go away after World War II. They didn't go away like they had done for every other war up until then. They just stayed. They're still there. Yeah. And they're still there, and they pay for a war machine that's still there, that's still at virtually the same level, with Trump, now trying to break Barack Obama's record. He may break the World War II records, but they're right around the World War II level. Obama having, the Congress under President Obama having the record military spending since World War II. Both of those records may be shattered now, by people who will hardly lift a finger or speak a word against it, yet hate taxes. And the majority of whose taxes go to that war machine, and they avoid even knowing that. So, I mean, and with more serious people, and towards the end of the book, I get into this, it also helps to understand that the world is very, very, very different from the 1930s or 1940s. Conquest is almost unheard of. Territorial seizure almost doesn't happen anywhere. There are exceptions, but it's not the rule. The rule is fixed boundaries on countries. There are international bodies. There are international treaties on disarmament and rules of warfare and diplomacy. There are international courts for nations and for individuals. There are understandings and procedures for diplomacy and de-escalation and conflict resolution that were just never there, never imagined at the time of World War II. So the notion that Hitler is coming to get you, that there have been, I mean, we could go through and count them, but it's dozens of evil foreign dictators who were supported by the CIA up until like last Thursday, who are the new Hitler, who are in all the US newspaper headlines as the new Hitler, right? And none of them, I mean, even Hitler hardly resembles Hitler as he is in the movie.
Yeah, of course.
But the new Hitlers, they don't resemble Hitler at all, and they aren't coming to get you. So, well, that's a start anyway.
Okay. Thank you very much for this. Now, if you want, I have a few smaller question. Well, do you agree that World War II was an imperialist war between two groups of, I would say, evil governments? So it was an imperialist rivalry.
Absolutely. I'm not sure very many people dispute that. I guess in the US and its, NATO, sidekicks, some people would say only that it was German and Italian and Japanese imperialism. But you can go back and quote many on the good side of World War II openly talking about it as Western imperialism as well. And it was clearly a competition for empire, and there was clearly a winner and a loser. Multiple losers, great. The United Kingdom may view itself as a loser, having been superseded by the United States, but the United States was a big winner. And I work with an organization and a coalition of groups that spend a lot of time opposing military bases, trying to get military bases closed, trying to stop new military bases. And the United States has over 800 of these things in other people's countries. A lot
Exactly.
of them date to World War II.
Yes.
And the islands that the United States, destroyed with nuclear tests and currently uses to send missiles from California to practice for nuclear wars. I mean, these are islands that the United States stole from Japan. They didn't belong to Japan. They shouldn't belong to the United States. It's just one empire took stuff from another empire. Uh,
Absolutely.
and so, the Trump wants to take over Greenland, but the United States already has a base in Greenland. It already drove the people out who want their land back.
Yes.
And this stuff dates to World War II. Even pre-World War II for the United States, Roosevelt was making deals with the United Kingdom that included, for the U.S. side, getting bases, getting islands in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And so the empire building and the transition from British to U.S. empire was happening already in the lead up to World War II, when Roosevelt knew the U.S. was going into World War II, but nobody else did, and he was lucky.
Yes. So, okay, I totally agree with what you said. Uh, do you agree with me that the evils of Nazi Germany, we all know about them, are in the same category of the evils done under colonialism by the French, the British, and other European empires?
I mean, you can't exactly equate any two evil things, and it
I
creates
agree. Yeah.
horror in people's
That's why I
minds.
say in the same
Imagine.
category.
Right. No, I agree with you 1,000%. I'm just trying to save myself some number of nasty emails.
Yeah.
I think there's a book by a Swedish late wonderful author in Sweden called Kill All the Beasts or Exterminate All the Beasts, about the history of Western genocides, with the German genocide in World War II on the end. There were German genocides in Africa leading up to the German genocide in Europe. There were British and U.S. and Spanish genocides around the world. Uh, this was a European behavior. This was not exclusively, but primarily a European behavior,
Mhm.
leading up to the one example we're supposed to care about. So there are still people to this, just weeks ago on an anniversary in Southern Africa, trying to get people to care about the genocide the Germans committed there, and
Mhm.
nobody cares. This is like the future of Palestine. 90 years from now, there are people like, please care about our genocide, not just the Nazi genocide.
Mhm.
And so, every genocide is different, but they're all horrendously evil.
The, Na-
You know,
the Nazi genocide is used, sadly, to justify Western imperialism in World War II, which is, I find,
and
so
ever since,
sad.
and
And
ever
ever
since.
since, there is an author called Rudolf Rummel who wrote a book called Death by Government. I would show it to you, but I just don't find it in my bookshelf now. But he estimated that in the 20th century, governments killed like around 260 million people were killed by their own government. And what is interesting in that, when he ranks the top mass murderers, and I know that it's controversial, and look, I understand that the death from communism. I mean, left-wing historians disagree. There are some people that disagree with the 6 million number of the Holocaust. I mean, I think that I'm no expert, but I think we should have the right to discuss that. But I'm pretty hostile to communism. Though I understand why communism existed, and I understand the intent of people who support communism, and I can have open discussion with that. But the Rudolf Rummel in his he estimated that well the top mass murderer for him it's Mao's China, then it's the Soviet Union, but in third position you would think it's Nazi Germany and not. In his account, the third position is European colonialism. Only in the 20th century, he estimated that European colonialism would have killed 50 million people. And let's be clear, it's mostly France and Great Britain because Germany had colonies, but they didn't have a lot of them, and they stopped having them in 1919 after the Versailles Treaty. So the colonialism of the British, the French, the Belgian in Congo, the Dutch in Indonesia, they murdered a lot of people too. And for me, I don't see why the Nazis are worse than that. In fact, and a recent book I read, and it was, I'm sorry, the name is in French. La férocité blanche would mean the white ferocity. I hate the title of the book because it's the idea that white people are kind of evil, and I find that racist. Well, the author is a very leftist, but I can agree with a lot of things she says that the Nazis are portrayed as supremely or differently evil. But in fact, the only difference that the Nazi did compared to the other European is that they committed genocide against white people, which were the Jews. It was the only difference.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good points there that I agree with. I want to be, it's impossible to be clear enough, but I
Yeah.
want to be super incredibly clear that I don't have any tolerance for anyone suggesting anything remotely good about Nazis. Here I am in Charlottesville, Virginia, where Nazis came to our town 8 years ago and did a march that boosted bigotry and hatred and violence across the United States these past 8 years. And it's incredibly sickening. And I don't really care which evil is the most evil of all
Yeah.
these horrendous evils. I do think there's a problem with screaming this number 6 million all the time because people who do it will say, oh, and another 3 million we don't care much about because they weren't Jewish, right? It's 9 million human beings in these camps, but
Yeah.
6 million of them were Jewish. Well, this is a bizarre sort of bigotry in itself to care about 2/3 of the victims of some horror because they were of a particular ethnicity or religion. And it's bizarre to me to care about these 9 million when 50, 60, 70 million people were
80
killed
million people
in
died
World
in
War
World War II.
II,
Yes,
right?
exact.
Right. So World War II, in this fantasy where World War II is the cure for the disease of concentration camps, the cure is 10 times worse than the disease.
Exactly.
It doesn't make any
Exactly.
sense.
Yeah.
But when you get into counting how many people governments have killed over centuries, and of course you want to look at the U.S. And European
Mhm.
colonialism in the Americas, you got to go back to previous centuries to get the big
Exactly.
numbers. But this is something that's done through war. It's something that's done through starvation, but it's also something, I'm sorry to say to a libertarian, that's done through the failure to provide decent health care and retirement and education and a clean environment. And that is part and parcel of putting all your money into weaponry, putting all your money into soldiers, because when you put it into healthcare and environment and education and green energy, you save many times the number of lives that you kill with the wars. And so, if you're going to count all the deaths, the real way to count them with the real big numbers is to count the people whose lives you could easily have saved and didn't bother.
Yeah, but I don't disagree with what you said when you kind of criticize libertarianism, because I totally agree with the intent you have. I could maybe disagree with the solution, how it should be done, but I have no disagreement on this, just to be clear. So, if you were, okay, we talk about that wars are imperialism, not crusade of good against evil, but imperialism between two groups of evil. Uh, what do you think is the root cause of the world wars or the root cause of war itself or imperialism? For me, it's the state. It's the monopoly on violence. It's the centralization of power. It's the fact that government intervene in the economy, always in the favor of the rich. That's why I like the free market because me, I don't like and to live under an oligarchy of billionaire because most of their wealth was acquired through the state in some bad ways. Uh, and especially for me, for me, one of the worst thing that caused the oligarchy and also wars, it's the existence of a central banks that create an infinite amount of worthless paper dollars that goes into the asset of the rich that allows government to pay for war because if government would have stayed on the gold standard in 1914 after a few months they would have run out of gold and they would have gone bankrupt and the war would have ended. But when they have a central bank they can print money, and by printing money they steal the purchasing power of the people of their saving, and the war can continue. So for me, that's the reason. That's the state, the central bank. I don't like also the monopoly on education because the government can indoctrinate people to be patriotic and obedient, and therefore becoming good soldiers. I think it was the goal of the when Germany or Prussia invented the modern school system. It was the stated goal that we want to have obedient and patriotic citizens to have good soldiers. So for you, David, what would you say that is the root cause of wars?
Well, I don't know that I have an answer I can prove, and I don't know that the answer is one simple answer. I do think, quite obviously, the war machines today are deeply tied up with governments, with capitalists, with banks, with profits, with international alliances. I think, on the other hand, it can't be quite that simplistic, given that war dramatically predates nations and capitalism. And if you didn't have any states in Europe and you had little city states fighting each other all the time like they used to, you'd be declaring the lack of state to be the cause of war, because they've all been put into the European Union, which has crawled on its knees and sworn its loyalty to NATO, and they're taking everybody's money and they're going to put 5% of every economy into weapons and kiss Donald Trump's ring in
Yes.
The Hague next week. Then you're declaring states to be the cause of war. I think, I mean, it's sort of a truism that fails to give you the sort of answer you want. But I think the real answer to why is there war is cultural acceptance of war, because there have been very small tribal societies, there have been massive national governments, there are, to this day, most nations have monopolies on violence, have central banks, and have not started or joined in any wars for many decades or centuries. It's only certain governments, and those governments too have monopolies on violence at central banks and so forth, but just like the other ones. And the difference, and it's very few that really drive the war machine, right? I mean, it's only a handful of governments, and it's overwhelmingly the United States. No other nation, spends remotely near a fraction of what the United States does on war, or fights as many wars, or pushes as hard for wars, or puts bases in other people's countries like the United States does. And so to take something that this awful, unrepresentative government of 4% of us does, and say, oh, well, as some people do, it's human nature, or as other people do, oh, it's capitalism. I mean, Switzerland is capitalist too, right? And so the problem is, I mean, Margaret Mead went around the world. Now she's famous for saying, "Never doubt that a handful of committed people can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has." But she also studied societies all over the world, small and large, and said, war is culture. You have a culture that accepts war, you're going to have war. You have a culture that rejects war, that doesn't raise kids to glorify violence and revenge, you're not going to have war. Unfortunately, that's the simplest answer I can give. Maybe it's too simple, but I think it's the truth.
I absolutely love your answer, and I want to be clear that the reason I want to interview non-libertarian is because I want to get the maximum of arguments against war. Because I want to be humble. I'm not perfect. I consider myself a libertarian, but since I consider myself a libertarian, I have changed my mind on many things, and I'm totally uh, I want to admit I could be wrong. What I think is that the core value of libertarianism, which we call the non-aggression principle, I think it's valid morally. But what do we do with it? The debate is open. I know that there's a libertarian philosopher named Stéphane Molyneux, and he believes that, and he interviewed the late guy that was named Lloyd the Mouse, that they believed that they had an interview together that the root of war is in child abuse. So if they believe that they believe in non-violent parenting, they believe that children that are abused physically and verbally and psychologically by their parents
Yeah.
is one of the root of war. And well, so unfortunately, I don't have kids, but if I would have had a child, for me it was clear: you don't yell, you never hit a child.
Yeah, if there's a
So,
website that a professor has set up from the University of North Carolina that lists and documents peaceful societies, including indigenous societies existing today around the world, that have no war, and in most cases have no violence and have no murder, and have, or it's very, very rare. And what you notice is that they don't raise children to vent their emotions and express their anger and pursue revenge. They raise them, for better or worse, to not be angry, to be more forgiving, and to be
okay.
more cooperative and resolving of tensions than exacerbating of tensions. And so there are things we can't simply copy some long gone or very small society on a massive scale. We certainly can't do it instantly and easily, but there are things to learn here
Yes.
that at least debunk this claim that it's human nature to act like an American. Right? It's not. It's American nature to act like an American, and that's malleable. That you can change. So if people are going to borrow some horrible idea from US culture, I would much prefer it be libertarianism than militarism.
Oh, thank you.
Because for most people it's militarism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, look at Europe. The United States should be learning from Europe.
Yeah.
Europe put money into human needs, into retirement and education and green energy and parks and transportation and childcare, a social safety net, a social support system that created happier lives, longer lives, healthier lives. The US should be saying, look at this success. We should copy that. Instead, it's the exact opposite. And
Yeah.
the Europeans saying, we must destroy all of that because NATO says so.
Their leaders, European leaders, whether they're from the so-called left or right parties, are
Right.
probably all aboard the war train right now, which is sad. So,
Almost all.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we agreed because before last Thursday, before our first fail attempt for the interview, I had reread all the highlighted passage of your book. I think we agreed that uh, the Holocaust doesn't justify World War II, but in fact, World War II made possible the Holocaust. I think we agree on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the refusal, I mean, there were any number of steps that could have been taken
Exactly.
before it got to the point of the Nazis wanting to expel the Jews. We'll put them on luxury cruise ships, send them anywhere. That didn't have to happen. But once that happened, you could have taken them. You
Yeah,
could have accepted them. You could have rescued these people. And instead, what did you get? You
they
got a
turned them back.
Holocaust and you got an imperial expedition into Palestine.
Yeah.
Uh,
They said they didn't have the logistic to welcome the Jews, but they had the logistic to invade Europe. So no, that doesn't make sense.
yes, to invade Europe, to destroy cities, and to evacuate all those British troops from Germany when they needed to. They had the ships.
Exact, yes. So we're almost closing. Maybe a few last question. Uh, I would like to know, what do you think about the Soviet Union and Stalin and the communist system that existed there? I'm curious to have your view. What do you think about that experiment?
Well, it was obviously a disaster. It was encouraged to be a disaster by other governments around the world. It wasn't, the United States didn't try to help the Soviet Union succeed in its goals, but it wasn't well planned, it wasn't well run, and it was taken over by a lunatic, power mad dictator who's going to make the worst of any system.
Mm,
Uh, the the notion of sharing things is obviously a better notion than that of kill, 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 grab, 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 get it all for me. Can I beat Elon Musk?
I agree.
But in between there, the success, relative success to other places that you've seen in places like Scandinavia, where you tax rich people at least a lot, not everything, but a lot, where you don't have an oligarchy, where you allow labor unions to exist, where you create programs that are popular because they're for everybody, right? You give retirement to the poor, to the middle class, and to the gazillionaires alike, equally, everybody. Well, then nobody hates it. Nobody calls it bigoted. Nobody tries to destroy it. Maybe libertarians, but that's it. And nobody, sees it as a racist, bigoted enterprise. It's something for everyone. And I mean, if the United States had that, if it didn't have to go through all these tests to prove you're worthy of getting a free lunch at school, then, well, first of all, it would be cheaper. The libertarians would love this. You would save all the money wasted on means testing and verifying and double checking, who's black, who's white, who's poor, who's rich. You just give everybody the same because they're human, right? Well, then people in the United States wouldn't hate taxes as much. I mean, I'm sorry for haters of taxes, but when you pay taxes and get something in return, you don't hate them as much. And this was the idea of the Soviet Union that didn't do it ideally, that went too far in some wrong directions, and of course developed a brutal, invasive government of spy agencies and camps. It's got to be done a lot more wisely than that. But we don't really need to invent it anew.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, some parts of the world, including Europe, have had incredible success that they themselves don't appreciate.
Okay. Last little question. I think I have on my YouTube channel, I have my most, the video that I made that got the most view is a video about why Winston Churchill was a war criminal. I consider Winston Churchill as one of the most evil and disgusting men, uh, especially because he is portrayed as a hero. At least Hitler, I think Hitler has been lied about, but even when I say that, I think he was a very evil man and he did very evil stuff. For me, Nazism just represent German imperialism with with a flavor of anti-Semitism and anti-communism. So I don't
Well,
I
Winston,
praise the Nazi, but for me, Winston Churchill was like it was kind of the same of Hitler, but probably a lot more dishonest. Because at least Hitler, I think I find him. I'm sure he lied a lot, but on many aspects he was brutally honest, a lot more than Churchill. And Churchill for me breaking the myth of Churchill is maybe a mission in my life. So do you agree with me that Churchill was an evil monster?
well, he truly was. He was a human being. I want to make clear. I think it's a Nazi behavior to distinguish human beings from evil monsters. They're all human beings, even Hitler, even Churchill. They
You're
all
right.
have
You're
good
right. You're right.
they all have good bits in them with the bad. But if you want to pick out people with the most bad, people who are the most evil, people who have done the most harm, I think Hitler's on the list. I think Churchill's on the list too. And they both were anti Semitic in very similar ways. How they talked about Jews prior to World War II, almost identical. How they talked about Marxism and the Jews, uh, how Churchill talked about using chemical weapons on people
Exactly. Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the Middle East because they're not people, because they're evil monsters. And how Churchill very likely manipulated the United States into World War One. How
And World War
Churchill
II
how
too.
Churchill made sure the Lusitania was not protected and was destroyed, and
Exactly.
Churchill. I mean, the British, including the wonderful Roald Dahl, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, children's author, they made fake maps of how the Nazis were going to slice up the Americas from
Yeah.
Canada to Argentina.
Yeah.
And I mean, Churchill had an agency in the United States working secretly to manipulate the United States into World War II.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to not care about that after the fact. You're supposed to say, oh, thank you for having lied to us and manipulated us into World War II because it's the greatest thing we ever did. How is it a great democratic enterprise if you had to be lied and manipulated into it? And why was it the business of a foreign nation to
Yes.
do so? Now it tends to be Israel that you're supposed to let lie and
Mhm.
manipulate you. Then it was the UK. But either way, how is that a good thing?
I agree. For me, what the worst that I hate about Churchill is that Churchill could have ended the war, or at least instead of World War II being a world war in Europe, it could have been a regional war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. It would have been disgusting, it would have been bloodied, but the people of UK, France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, Denmark, Greece, Yugoslavia would have been saved. The Jews there would have been saved. And for me, I consider Churchill to be mainly responsible for the war becoming a world war. I think for me, it's obvious that I don't want to praise Hitler, but Hitler could have killed the bunch of the British Army at Dunkirk in 1940, and he let them go in order to try to make peace. I think it's one of the big lie about World War II in Churchill. So now that we're ending, I think, well, I would just want to talk a little bit about books. I presented your book. I think you were a big fan of, I think you read, because I look at the references in your book, and I think you quote a lot Nicholson Baker and Human Smoke.
Yeah, great
I
book.
read that book twice. I bought it like 4 times. I offered one to a cousin, one to my mother, because I think that for a person who is open-minded about World War II but doesn't know a lot, it's probably one of the best books to read
I,
because it's easy. You can read one page at a time. Nicholson Baker is a pacifist. I tried to interview him, but he said that he's so disgusted by what happened in the world right now, the war in Ukraine and Palestine, that he said that he's unable to talk about it.
really.
And I, because I would have loved to interview the guy. So now I was just wondering that are you? have you read this book from Pat Buchanan? It's called Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. If you haven't,
I think so.
it's like it's the I would say it's the right wing version that because there were two books that became popular in the last 15 to 20 years about World War II revisionism, and it's those two books. Human Smoke by Baker is a
Oh,
more
Pat
from
Buchanan, yeah.
yeah. I know that if you're more of a left wing person, you may not like the guy, but the guy is come to the same conclusion than Baker on many aspects. So it's the book like if a person is a I would say is a left wing person, Human Smoke is the book to read. If the person is more of a right wing conservative, but she's open to put in question World War II, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War by Pat Buchanan is probably the book to read. So if you haven't, by reading it, you could just learn more arguments against World War II. Me, finally, my favorite historian is Ralph Raico. He was a history and philosophy professor, and he was a libertarian. So he wrote a book here, which is Great War and Great Leader, a Libertarian, Your Rebuttal. So in that book, he destroyed the myths of World War One, World War Two. He destroyed the myths of Churchill too. So. So, David, I want to thank you very much for that time. It was a great pleasure for me to talk with you. Is there something you want to say for maybe the my tiny listeners or other people?
No, thank you. I think we've said a lot. I appreciate it. I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. I've got some books to maybe go read or look back at. May not agree with, may passionately disagree with some things in some of them, but agree with others. So, and it's important that we be able to do that without hating each other or
But me,
engaging in violence.
look, I still have friends that are communists. I interviewed Jacques Powell, the author of The Myth of the Good War, that you quote many times in your own books. I met him in person because Jacques Powell lives in Canada, in Brampton. I met him in person when he published one of his book, I think in 2016, and I interviewed him last fall. I can send you a link of the video. But he's a Marxist and he believes Stalin was a good guy. For me, that's like, but I didn't debate him on that. I presented him and I wanted to have his view on World War II. Because, like I said, I want to offer the people that that can tolerate my French accent and listen to me. I want to bring the most argument to debunk World War II so we can end those war that we have right now. And it's kind of scary because now we have a lot of nuclear weapon and what is happening just today between Israel and Iran. It's scary. We could just all die or live through a nuclear winter, which we don't want. I prefer to live under I prefer to be taxed even if it goes for something that I dislike than be killed in a war. So
I
David, thank you
agree.
very much.
Thank you.
Okay.